Make up mind. Fight.
I have spent a lot of time playing casual heavy in Team Fortress 2. Time I could have spent getting a degree or securing a fruitful career, I instead spent holding M2 and M1 in a 17-year-old game. Heavy is my favorite class. I just think he's very satisfying and fun to play, despite the general community consensus that he's pretty boring. Part of my appreciation for heavy stems from my time experimenting with his different weapon options. Some people carry the idea that all of Heavy's miniguns and playstyles are the same, and don't tend to deviate too far from either Stock or the Tomislav as a result. I personally like to use all of Heavy's miniguns pretty equally, and in this video, I want to express some stuff that I've learned. We're going to be ranking Heavy's miniguns for casual from what I feel to be his weakest option to what I feel to be his strongest option. I want to note a few addendums to the base concept of this video, as I know I'll get some pretty obnoxious comments otherwise. 1. We are talking specifically about casual TF2. Not competitive, not Highlander, not sixes, not anything like that. Casual is the environment I have the most experience in, and also a very different environment than any competitive format. Casual has more variables in play. There's more people on the map, there's no class or item restrictions, there's less communication, and there's a lot of randomness, so trying to hold a discussion about casual to a competitive standard is kind of apples and oranges. If you bring up competitive and trickle-down balance in my comments, then I'd like to remind you that your best features trickle down your mom's leg in the brothel bathroom. Secondly, I want to stress a very important note for the ranking process of this video. I genuinely don't believe that any of Heavy's miniguns are bad. While some are certainly better or worse than others, it takes a lot to be a genuinely bad TF2 weapon, and I think that even Heavy's least good minigun is just kind of middling at the very worst. If we were doing tiers for this video, then I promise you that none of them would go below a C. I don't really have a clear-cut set of criteria worked out on how these weapons will be ranked. It's kind of a nebulous mixture of how fun the weapon is to use, how flexible and splashable it is into loadouts, how likely you are to die using it, and how generally effective it is in a casual environment. Also, a lot of preference. The last two entries on this list are like 99% preference in my personal opinions, and are not rooted in any sort of objectivity at all. Keep that in mind. Ranking is ultimately a shallow and reductive exercise, and I'm basically just using this as an excuse to review some heavy weapons. That said, let's roll.
Run home to mama!
Oh boy, we're starting on controversial ground. Not only is the chalk pick for Heavy's worst minigun usually reserved for a much more commonly accepted choice than this, but the Brass Bee specifically is also a weapon that I know some people really love. Like, I've had some people dedicate multiple comments across multiple unrelated videos to telling me how wrong I am for not loving this thing, and I feel like it's important to note what I said earlier about none of Heavy's miniguns being bad. The Brass Beast is not a bad weapon in the grand scheme of TF2. It still does a ton of damage and can absolutely carry the day in the right hands. My reason for having it ranked as the weakest of Heavy's miniguns for casual is simple. This is, by far, the minigun that requires the most sweeping playstyle adjustments out of any of Heavy's options. It mandates adaptation and playing the way it wants you to more than any other minigun. The Brass Beast is a minigun that stats and intended use cases should be entirely clear. It does a lot of damage, the highest close range sustain in the game in fact, yet slows Heavy's already below average mobility to an agonizing crawl. The thought of giving a minigun, which is already a powerhouse in terms of this game's damage numbers, a flat, measurable damage bonus is kind of insane conceptually, and I guess Valve realized it because it's all this weapon really does. Well, okay, it also has a damage resistance below half health, but that's also shared with another weapon, and called it a hunch that most people are not equipping this weapon specifically because of it. It's still good though. But yeah, if you want to output absolutely gargantuan, insane sustained damage as Heavy, a class who already comfortably outpaces every other class's damage at close range, then this is the weapon for you. It takes Heavy's already sky-high damage output and just shoots it through the fucking roof and into the sky. Anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in a close range battle with a revved up Brass Beast Heavy will likely die before they can even process what's happening. If you're around long enough to see the Heavy shoot, it means that he's not aiming at you. This thing's time to kill at close range is literal milliseconds. On top of that, the damage resistance below half health is a sleeper underrated stat. It might seem a little pointless, but due to the way it actually functions, it's surprisingly helpful. It enables Heavy to survive an extra demo pipe or sniper quickscope, which can absolutely be the clincher you need to pull out a narrow victory. Damage thresholds are more important in TF2 than raw damage numbers, and the Brass Beast allowing you to tough out several important ones is very strong. Demo men do not like it when Heavies only take 80 damage from a third direct hit pipe. Now, all of this probably sounds really badass. You're basically turning the game's dedicated damage hose tank into an even more beefed up version of a damage hose tank. I absolutely understand why some people would gravitate towards this weapon and enjoy using it. However, for my purposes, I find its negatives to be just a bit too limiting and fiercely uncompromising in terms of what they allow Heavy to do. Like I said at the top of this section, the Brass Beast mandates by far the most weapon-specific adaptation out of all of Heavy's miniguns. This is the closest thing to an alternative playstyle that Heavy's miniguns grant him, and it's not a very fun one in my opinion. Basically, the Brass Beast makes you really slow, like slower than Heavy normally is. It significantly slows its own spin-up time to over a full second, and also makes the Heavy move at a glacial pace while spun up. While spun up with the Brass Beast, Heavy is the single slowest player-controlled object in Team Fortress 2. Quite literally, nothing moves slower than him under normal gameplay circumstances. A cart with a few players on it can outrun him. And the over 1 second spin-up time is kind of huge in a game where most classes are capable of outputting hundreds of damage in the blink of an eye. Remember what I said earlier about being face-to-face with the spun-up Brass Beast Heavy being guaranteed death? Yeah, that comes with the pretty huge caveat that he's able to spin up before you kill him. Most weapons in TF2 have incredibly brief attack intervals and incredible close-range damage, and it's very easy to simply outpace a Brass Beast Heavy's movement and damage if you catch him unprepared. Because of this, the Brass Beast absolutely mandates patient, careful, and predictive play. The optimal strategy for the Brass Beast is to hunker down around a corner near an important defensive position and shoot anyone who comes into view. You become a sentry. And in that niche, it's great. Uncontested even. In the field of staying still and shooting people who come to you, the Brass Beast wins an award in excellence. But on a class who's frequently criticized for being extremely linear, boring, and easy, I don't know if this is the type of playstyle we want to be fetishizing. I said this in my beginner's trap weapons video, but it really feels as though people who hate playing Heavy have only experienced playing him in the way that the Brass Beast encourages. And I know you might be thinking, well, Heavy is slow. He's the slowest class in the game already, so what's wrong with making him even slower to maximize his damage output? Well, I'll be honest, this is a fundamentally bad take. This ideology misunderstands Heavy at a base foundational level, at least in casual. Because rest assured, Heavy is not a sentry. He is not a wall or an area denial tool. He is a tank, a slow-moving yet incredibly deadly mobile team anchor that can quite literally throw his weight around to provide an important central damage dealer and anchor for his team. With any other minigun, you can push into enemies while firing, acting as a do-not-pass damage source for your team to rally around as they force through an important enemy hold. He is an anchoring point. When the Heavy starts pushing in, that's his team's cue to do the same. This is Heavy's primary role in casual. He is a tank and a team anchor and not a turret. The Brass Beast ignores this in favor of an ill-suited min-maxing design philosophy that strong-arms Heavy into a playstyle which only accentuates his worst traits as a class. And honestly, real talk, the extra damage isn't even that big a deal. It is certainly very fun and funny, but as we've mentioned a few times, Heavy already does the highest close-range sustained damage in the game, so what is there really to be gained by sacrificing your already very limited mobility to do even more? What damage thresholds are you crossing? What fights are you winning that would have been out of your grasp otherwise? Was it really necessary to shave 0.75 milliseconds off of killing that enemy soldier? Would you have been able to do it anyways with a second shorter jump rev using any other minigun? It just strikes me as extremely indulgent, excessive, and unnecessary. It makes you think the extra damage is the linchpin that's keeping you alive, when in reality, you're already doing over 500 DPS, or more than double most other classes' health, with stock either way. That's ultimately what pisses me off the most about the Brass Beast. It's so tantalizing, the promise of the highest damage in the game, yet on a class that does not need the help, and in fact, needs the extra flexibility afforded by other miniguns significantly more. Heavy is not a JRPG character. You can't get by on min-maxing his stats and calling it a day. And listen, I know a lot of you watch this section and are absolutely seething right now. The Brass Beast is your favorite weapon, and you're typing a comment, or maybe already have, arguing against every point I've made here and telling me how great and strong it actually is, and how stupid I am for not liking it. Oh, bring a shotgun instead of the sandwich. Oh, stand in front of the card and let it push you. Oh, it's Heavy on hard mode. Things like that. And listen, I get it. It's a very appealing weapon. But I'm gonna leave this section with an open challenge to you, Mr. or Mrs. Angry at the Video Brass Beast main. Just try a different minigun. Play with stock or the Tomislav or the Huo-Long Heater for like a few games. I think you'll see what I mean. And if not, then go ahead and post that angry ranty comment. That said, on to our next weapon.
The burning you feel? It is shame.
Now, here's what you probably all expected to be at the bottom. I know that decisively placing the Huo-Long Heater above the Brass Beast is a very, very bold move, but I speak fully in earnest when I say that this feels like a weapon that's mostly marred by people misunderstanding its primary application and playstyle in casual specifically. Whenever you hear people talk about the Huo-Long, it's always about how it chews through ammo so quickly, and how its Ring of Fire mechanic is barely effective against Spy, who it feels like it was designed to counter. However, as someone who's used the Huo-Long Heater more than I'd probably like to admit, I think this weapon is generally super fun and gets a very unfair rep. I think it's not only good and casual, but also the best weapon out of the Triad pack by a significant margin. And it's all down to one simple fact. This thing does a lot of fucking damage.
That is bullshit blazing, still my heart is blazing. If the word kill me, I don't need a new word under you.
I know what you might be thinking. Well, it has a 10% damage penalty, so it's pretty much dead on arrival. However, not only is it still head and shoulders above the Natascha, but even before the fire is considered, this weapon's base damage per second is about on par with the Tomislav thanks to that weapon's decreased firing speed. So you're already not sacrificing much by equipping it. 10% is a minuscule reduction on a weapon category that outputs damage in excess of 400 per second. On top of this, it does even more at close range. This weapon's primary mechanic is that it generates a constantly present ring of fire at the heavy's feet while he's revved, meaning that anyone close to the heavy on any side gets lit on fire. The Ring of Fire deals 12 damage per second to people currently in it, 5 damage per tick of afterburn for a total of 80 over time, and most importantly, causes this weapon to deal 25% extra damage. The Huo-Long deals a flat 25% more damage to all burning enemies. This means that, between this damage boost, the flat damage of the Ring of Fire, and the afterburn, this thing's raw damage per second at close range outpaces even the Brass Beast, and is the true highest sustained damage dealing weapon in the game. But oh, enemies won't always be on fire, you say. Haha, they will be if you're near them, because the Ring of Fire is always in effect while this weapon is revved. Any argument you can make in favor for the Brass Beast's damage at close range can be made in equal measure for this weapon, as anyone you'll be fighting within touching distance will always be lit on fire, and you'll always be dealing the increased damage to them. This weapon effectively has a flat 25% extra damage at point blank range that also works on burning enemies from any range. And unlike the Brass Beast, it does not strong arm you into playing any differently. It's functionally identical to stock in terms of rev time, bullet spread, and movement speed. This means that the Huo-Long Heater absolutely flourishes in multiple niche situations. In choke points, or when attacking sentry nests, it shreds enemies in milliseconds. On defense, it can single-handedly wall off narrow spaces to potential flankers and spies. When dropping on enemies from above, you can comfortably ignite an entire team at once and shred them all so quickly that they won't even have a chance to react. If you truly view this thing as just an ineffective spy counter, then you must be playing the game through the Pyro's mask, because you have a real narrow point of view. The Ring of Fire and its consequent damage basically gives Heavy access to a close-range AoE debuff that he can adeptly capitalize on. Now, I've blown a lot of smoke out my ass about how good this weapon is, but to be 100% transparent, it's still Heavy's second weakest minigun for casual, from my experience anyway. This mainly comes from its actual listed downside, as well as a more consequential unlisted downside. Let's start with the real one. This weapon passively consumes 4 ammo per second while revved. This means that, from full ammo, without firing at all, you can only stay revved for a maximum of 50 seconds. It does take a second for the ammo consumption to kick in, and constantly jump revving back and forth won't cause it to decrease at all. You have to be actively revved for about a second before it kicks in. This seems pretty transparently designed to counter the Ring of Fire's effectiveness as an area denial tool, as it keeps you from staying permanently brainlessly revved up in place with no required thought. This is obviously a pretty huge downside, as it limits your ability to consistently stay primed for a fight and punishes you for attempting to play passively. It's the opposite problem that the Brass Beast has. However, I'd be lying if I said I found this downside to be anywhere near as crushing as the Brass Beast. For one, there are a lot of ammo sources in TF2. Ammo packs are sprinkled throughout maps, dispensers exist. On payload attack specifically, the cart acts as a constantly refilling ammo source, making the Huo-Long pretty unmatched as a cart heavy weapon, and most importantly, enemies drop medium ammo packs when killed. So if you're proactively scouring the map and scooping up any dropped ammo from enemies you take down, you should never find yourself at a severe deficit of bullets. Where this stat is genuinely troublesome though is in sustained firefights. If you're trying to hold an important position and just exchanging fire with the enemy team without anyone crossing any lines or dying, then you can very quickly find yourself running out of ammo. Heavy is great in these situations for putting pressure on enemies and taking out overextenders, and the Huo-Long Heater genuinely does limit his ability to do that. If people aren't dying around you, you have no way to stay constantly topped off and maxed out. Aside from this, I find the true downside of the Huo-Long Heater to be that it's exceptionally map and game state dependent. It's honestly not great on a lot of maps, ones with a lot of wide open space and areas for enemies to fight you from, and if the enemy team is smart enough not to engage at close range, then you're in a bad position. Additionally, if you're not able to force close range engagements, like in choke points or dropping on enemies, then it's kind of a waste to equip this thing. The Huo-Long works best in situations where you can surprise enemies with the fact that you have it, or otherwise force situations to take advantage of its unique strengths. In situations where its positives aren't applicable, then this is strictly a worse minigun. The Huo-Long Heater is ultimately a side grade. It's a weapon that has its niches and absolutely flourishes in them, yet isn't the right call for every game state and situation. My rationale for placing it above the Brass Beast is that the situations it's applicable in are more common and it's stronger in those situations, while also not requiring that the player make nearly as many concessions to get the most out of it. When this thing works, there is nothing else like it in the game. The speed at which you can shred through enemies is simply insane. But in situations where it doesn't work, it's basically a waste to equip. But don't let this lack of universal utility convince you that it's an all-around bad weapon. The Rescue Ranger also isn't perfect in every situation, but nobody would call it bad. This dragon just requires knowing when to wake it and let it fly to make the most out of it. And it is Year of the Dragon after all, so give this thing a try.
All will fear my giant new gun.
We've moved on from the miniguns that are good in certain situations to the miniguns that are applicable in most situations. Any weapon that has an all-purpose use case is naturally more inclined to be better than a more situational one, but unfortunately, one of these still has to be the worst on offer. For our purposes, that would be the Natascha. Now, the Natascha is interesting for this video, as it's probably the least used out of all of Heavy's miniguns, unless you're a newer player who's just unlocked it, or a bored, curious Heavy main. Otherwise, you won't be using it that much. It's also a weapon that some people really fucking hate and view as the crutchiest and most deplorable of Heavy's primaries. But how can a weapon hold both of those distinctions simultaneously? How can a weapon be underused but also hated by the player base? Well, the Natascha is a weapon that fills a very specific underrepresented niche in TF2. It provides guaranteed on-hit slowdown, an Overwatch-esque CC effect in exchange for dealing less damage. Slowdown effects are exceptionally rare in TF2, with only this weapon and the nerfed Sandman featuring them as dedicated mechanics. Slowdown effects are so rare in this game that they're internally considered knockback rather than their own unique effect category. Of the two, the Natascha is easily the more noteworthy and despised of the game's slowdown weapons. That said, the slowdown doesn't really work in the way you'd expect it to, especially if you're more used to games like Overwatch, so I want to explain it real quick. In essence, the Natascha induces approximately half a second of slowdown with each bullet it lands, with enemies on the receiving end of it effectively being halted in place for the specific instance that they're struck. It's more of a blink and you miss it stun with each bullet rather than a debuff or incremental slow. On a single shot weapon, this probably wouldn't be a big deal, as evidenced by the Sandman, but on the fastest firing, sustained damage dealing weapon category in the game, it's pretty insane. You can effectively anchor enemies in place as you rapidly hammer them with guaranteed slowing bullets which fire in excess of several dozen a second. It's worth noting that this effect does deteriorate and weaken over longer distances, even if the actual extent of it isn't well documented, but that just means that this weapon is most effective at close range, just like any other minigun. Now, the concept of giving a minigun of all weapons guaranteed on-hit slowdown is obviously pretty crazy. Even Overwatch has the good sense not to put CC on any character's rapid hit scan primary fire. To be fair, it's realistic. I'd probably slow down too if I was shot by a minigun, but it's still pretty insane. This effect makes it virtually impossible for enemies to contest a revved up Heavy one shot outside of standing their ground and fighting. A lot of players' first instincts in coming face to face with the Heavy is to run away, either out of his minigun's range, around a corner, or out of the Heavy's immediate view for some sleek juking. The Natascha disables all of these options, harshly punishing players for attempting to engage with Heavy in any way that they typically would. More so than anything else, the Natascha is a weapon that provides answers for several of Heavy's most notable counterplay maneuvers and laughs at enemies for attempting them. And due to this weapon's visual similarities to stock, it's literally just a differently textured drum and ammo belt on the side. It's very easy to not realize what you're fighting until it's too late. This weapon cripples virtually every class in the game and makes their matchup knowledge and experience against Heavy pretty obsolete. Mobility-focused classes like Scout and rocket jumping soldiers are obviously screwed. Pyros have trouble closing the distance to counterattack, demos have trouble repositioning themselves, medics and especially spies have trouble escaping when caught out, and even engineers lose their ability to flee after their building buildings are destroyed or juke around the heavy. The only classes who aren't significantly hampered while fighting this weapon are enemy heavies who can handily outdamage it, and snipers who aren't often in minigun range either way. But even then, there is an additional stat on this weapon that covers those two bases handily. It has the same damage res below half health as the Brass Beast, and this time on a much more flexible and splashable minigun. This can narrowly allow for fringe situations where you can barely outdamage a heavy in a 1v1, or survive a quickscope to either escape or fully close the distance on an enemy sniper. This means that, to some extent, the Natascha provides answers for every class in the game. This stat is already good on the Brass Beast, but on a weapon with a heavily punishing positive and much less playstyle facilitating negatives, it's especially noteworthy. And that's not even mentioning the other damage thresholds you can obviously survive with it. All in all, the slowdown on hit effect is pretty goddamn gargantuan. It's one of the strongest singular stats given to any weapon in the game, and because of this, Valve was pretty keen to heavily counterbalance it. For one, there's a well-documented bug that causes any slowdown effect in TF2 to be mitigated if you rapidly strafe left and right while moving forward. This is often cited as a direct counter to the Natascha, but I've literally never seen someone do it in game, and called it a hunch that it won't be most players' first instinct when being fired on by a revved up heavy. It's a fun anecdotal piece of trivia, but not terribly applicable in the actual game. No, the Natascha's actual downsides are its damage and spin-up penalties. Starting with the latter, the Natascha spins up significantly slower than stock, but faster than the Brass Beast, putting its time before you can actually start firing it at around 1 second. I don't find this to be nearly as crippling as it is on the Brass Beast, as the more lenient numbers and lack of a flat move speed penalty after revving means you can still comfortably jump rev and push in uninhibited. It's just something you'll have to adjust to if you switch to it after getting used to another minigun, which I don't think has ever gotten me killed in an actual gameplay scenario, but it is still something to consider when first switching to this weapon. The real worst part of the Natascha is its flat damage penalty. This thing deals the lowest damage out of all of Heavy's miniguns, capping out at just under 400 DPS. This is still tremendous, and still comfortably within the highest echelons of the game's damage outputs, but a noticeable downgrade compared to every other option. It doesn't matter too much against the squishier burst damage classes, and it can actually be somewhat mitigated due to the slowdown allowing you time to more consistently shoot them, but against other sustained damage sources, it's a different story. When fighting against enemy heavy, sentries, larger groups of enemies, or other big sources of damage, the Natascha simply can't keep up. Fights that would have easily been won with any other option take an extra second or two with the Natascha, and that time really isn't expendable in the average trade in TF2. For sustained firefights and close 1v1s, especially beyond close range, the Natascha's lack of damage and diminishing returns on its slowdown make it less of a no-brainer than you'd probably think. But honestly, I think that's fine. If this thing were any stronger, I could easily see it being among the most reviled weapons in the game. It should not be able to slow enemies down and also kill them as fast as stock or the Brass Beast. For what it is, I find the Natascha to be a useful and fun heavy side grade that's more thoughtfully balanced than people give it credit for. It's very annoying to be killed by, but to Valve's credit, they clearly took great care in giving it stats that made sure that not one part of it was too overbearing. Its lack of damage and slowdown on hit counterbalance each other in such a way that keeps either from completely defining its existence. While I don't think the Natascha is exceptionally great, and I understand the community's lack of reverence for it, I don't think it's nearly as problematic as people make it out to be, either in the OP or UP way, and next time you get slowed down by it, just remember that it could have been a lot worse. Now, I want to know a few important distinctions for these next two entries. These are both way, way better than everything we talked about before them. If the previous weapons were a C or a B tier, then these next two comfortably skip over A tier and cleanly slide into S tier. These are some of the best primary weapons in the game available to any class. I went back and forth on which one to put ahead of the pack a lot, and basically find them to be interchangeable. Whichever one you like is totally more valid, and it all comes down to personal preference. Remember that in 10 seconds and you start writing an angry comment. That said, my number 2 heavy minigun is...
Who dare stand against me now?
So this will probably make y'all click off the video. The Tomislav is one of those TF2 weapons, like the flare gun, Uber Saw, or Crusader's crossbow, that's basically seen as a stock replacement, an uncontested best in slot pick that handily outpaces every other option, and the true go-to by default for most serious heavy players. Personally, I've always struggled to view the Tomislav through this filter. As well, it's certainly amazing, and arguably Heavy's best all-around minigun. It does genuinely have a few small aspects that I personally get caught up on more than any other other option that keep me from considering it as a genuine objective upgrade. For what it's worth, it's a game of inches. I literally had this at number 1 until I wrote the script and realized that I liked the minigun more. These could change on any given day for me. I also wrote this at like 3 AM, so take it with a grain of salt. But all that said, let's talk about the Tomislav. The Tomislav is a minigun obviously styled after a Thompson submachine gun, or Tommy gun, an iconic lightweight selective fire SMG that was popular with gangsters during the Prohibition era. You'd think turning a famously disposable SMG into a minigun wouldn't translate that great, but you'd be wrong, as this weapon generally rules. It specializes in securing efficient, clean kills on important key targets. It struggles in sustained firefights against high volumes of incoming damage. The Tomislav has a faster spin-up, tighter bullet spread, and a silent rev compared to stock, yet fires each individual bullet noticeably slower. The faster spin-up is a pretty cut-and-dry stat. It's a universally helpful and useful buff to Heavy's general game plan that gives him significantly more flexibility in terms of when and where he can engage with enemies. It's a stat that would benefit any primary weapon on the class, and to a lot of people, is the definitive thing that makes a Tomislav such a no-brainer. Being able to start firing much quicker after being engaged makes Heavy much less of a sitting Robin than he would be otherwise. It pretty handily livens up the average Heavy match and is all around a very good stat. The tighter spread, on the other hand, is much more interesting, as it could be seen as either a positive or a negative depending on what situation you're applying it in. It gives the Heavy much more agency to fight at longer ranges, and turns him into a surprisingly effective rapid-fire pseudo-sniper who can pick off low-health enemies as they flee or scramble for health. Combine it with crits from any source, and you've basically got a rapid-fire stream of guaranteed instant death lasers flying at the enemy. That said, it also significantly tightens Heavy's area of influence ahead of him, requiring much more precision and careful tracking to consistently land your shots. You won't be getting that many lag compensation around corner kills with this weapon. Heavy isn't a class known for requiring much mechanical skill, so the tighter spread can be a rude awakening for people who already struggle to track enemies. He's stronger at long range with this weapon, yet noticeably weaker at close range. This is further compounded by the flat, slower firing speed that this weapon boasts. Simply put, the pace of this weapon's bullets is absolutely plodding. You can probably count each individual one as they come out, and it results in a weapon that doesn't feel nearly as devastating or powerful as its contemporaries. Whereas the other miniguns are miniguns, this certainly feels like a modified SMG. The slower firing speed combined with the tighter spread makes securing kills with this weapon much stricter than it is with any other Heavy primary, and it often struggles to confirm kills on important targets. They'll either slip away from you on low HP or narrowly manage to outgun you. The common argument is that this weapon's DPS doesn't numerically fall too far behind stock, which is true, but I can confidently say that I've experienced times where enemies just barely escape when I was using this weapon. It does objectively have a lower DPS than stock due to its slower firing speed. Thankfully, this is offset by this weapon's other positive stat, which is a shockingly useful silent killer attribute. This weapon makes no passive noise while it's revved up, which does genuinely aid in the rare stealth Heavy playstyle. Hiding around corners or under map geometry fully revved up can be a scary surprise for enemies, as Heavy generally isn't considered the most inconspicuous class in the game. This, combined with its faster spin-up, results in frequent situations where you can fire on enemies before they can on you, allowing you to offset the lower DPS with resourceful play and good timing. All of these stats combined comfortably suit the Tomislav as Heavy's de facto criminal minigun. It was introduced in the criminal-themed item set after all. It's a gun that makes Heavy his team's enforcer, their Iceman. With the Tomislav, the Heavy becomes capable of handily securing very clean and efficient kills on the enemy team's most important members. Thanks to its litany of positive stats that all work in unison, he can do it with a grace and efficiency that isn't possible with any of his other miniguns. The Tomislav turns Heavy from a brutish tank into a calculated skirmisher and does so very well. And what's great is that it doesn't have to be an off-Heavy weapon. You'd think a weapon like this would flourish best for a second Heavy on a team as a sort of flank or backup Heavy, not unlike the quick fix to medic, but no, you can handily carry with this thing. On attack or defense, the Tomislav Heavy pushing into your team with backup behind him is a scary thing to contend with, and his range combined with his accuracy make him a tricky opponent to engage from any range. The Tomislav really is the ultimate aggro Heavy weapon, and suits a more aggressive and active playstyle extraordinarily well. So that's all fine and good. We basically just read its stats like an episode of the weapon subcategory series, but we do genuinely have to talk about why this weapon isn't ranked at number 1. A lot of Heavy mains view this weapon as the class's uncontested best in slot primary, so I'd better have a good reason for placing it at only number 2. And that reason is Yeah, I'll be brutally honest, it's mostly preference. That said, I do genuinely think there are situations where the Tomislav does fall flat compared to stock. Its slower firing speed and tighter spread make it less reliable at countering enemy heavies and sentries, and it all around has much less leniency than heavy's other options. It's a minigun that boasts a large amount of very potent positives, yet does feature negatives substantial enough to keep it in check as far as the game's general balance goes. Whereas the stock minigun is a good all-arounder for pretty much any situation, the Tomislav is a good all-arounder for pretty much most situations. There are fights that you won't win with it, there are heavies that'll outdamage you, scouts that'll escape, soldiers and demos that'll get that extra explosive in, etc. The Tomislav is a brutally powerful, class-defining weapon and one of the best unlocks in the game, but I kind of view it as in the soda popper category and not in the crossbow category. It's an alternative to stock and not a replacement for it, if that makes sense. All that said though, this is ultimately just preference, and the Tomislav is still an incredible gun. On any given day, I could swap it with stock, and I totally understand if some people can't fathom playing heavy without it. It's just one of the best unlockable weapons in the game, it's one of the best side grades in the game, and it's close to being heavy's best primary in the game for my purposes. That said,
It is good day to be giant man.
yeah, it really wasn't even close. I apologize and all, I realize the Tomislav is the popular choice and that Big Joey and all those competitive players swear by it, but for full disclosure, I fucking love the stock minigun. It's not only my favorite heavy weapon, but my favorite weapon in TF2, and one of my favorite weapons in any game ever. It's a weapon that's not only fun and effective in a casual environment, but also fiercely emblematic of what I love about Team Fortress 2. What is there really to say about the minigun? It's a stock weapon and one of the most ubiquitous on offer at that. If you've ever played Doom or Quake, then you know about the chain gun, the Gatling gun, or the minigun. It's a rapid-fire, high-damage-dealing, drum-fed Goliath ripped straight off the turret of an aircraft that's capable of shredding any unfortunate target in a matter of moments. It's a prime example of goofy video game hyper-violence, and just the kind of ridiculous weapon design that gave TF2 the staying power it needed to be here 17 years later. I do want to talk about it a bit in the context of the actual game though, as there is some nuance to the minigun that we've kind of glossed over for most of this video. At a base, the minigun fires 4 bullets per tick of ammo at a rate of 10 times per second. It deals tremendous damage, comfortably outputting over 500 DPS at close range, and dealing enough sustain to outpace every other damage source in the game without breaking a sweat. It does not get to do this for free though, requiring a 1 second ramp up period after revving up to reach maximum damage and accuracy. During this 1 second, it deals half as much damage as normal, and its firing cone is much wider to worsen its accuracy. It also has to rev up for just under a second before it can be fired, decreasing the heavy's movement speed while doing so, but the player can do this freely without needing to fire or expend any ammo. Lastly, it suffers from very harsh accuracy and damage fall off, with its usefulness noticeably deteriorating at longer ranges. All of this combined makes the minigun a weapon that thrives on one thing: commitment. Fighting with the minigun requires a confidence in where you begin each fight and a commitment to that fight that isn't present with any other class's stock weapon in the game. Keen game sense and situational awareness are required to get the most out of it. You have to know that where and when you're revving up is the optimal place and time to do it. It is not a lenient or forgiving primary, and playing under the assumption that you're invincible or bulletproof while using it will get you killed. And what's your reward for passing those necessary game sense checks? Oh, just the strongest weapon in the game. The minigun is the reason I love playing heavy, and a big reason why I love playing Team Fortress 2 so much in general. You want to know why it needs that 1 second of 50% damage ramp up? You want to know why sentries and MVM tanks passively take less damage from it? It's to give enemies a fighting chance. The minigun is the boss fight of TF2. A heavy who knows what he's doing and can throw his minigun around with confidence is the scariest thing in the game. This thing does so much damage so effortlessly, and with the backing support of a good team or just smart positioning, there is very little that can contend with it. The time to kill with this weapon is absolutely silly for a stock weapon. Anything save for an enemy soldier or heavy die in mere moments, and those two have the misfortune of living long enough to realize the mistake they've made. Even at medium range, the minigun can still comfortably outpace most damage sources in the game. There's a reason that what's considered outplaying a heavy is getting away from him and firing from where he can't see you. If he can, then you're likely dead. The minigun is uncompromising in terms of the raw damage and killing power it possesses in TF2 compared to the required investment to reach that point. Every other major damage dealer in TF2 has a condition. Sentries have to be built, rockets have splash fall off, sniper rifles have to charge, but aside from needing to rev up, the minigun has barely any of that. It's a minigun. It shoots a lot of bullets very fast and doesn't offer any concessions on how to deal with it. What a lot of people view as a brain-dead simplicity to Heavy's gameplay, I view as a refreshing dose of intuitiveness and honesty. If you want to do a lot lot of damage really fast and be really tanky, but be really slow, this is the class and gun for you. But what I love about the minigun is that that isn't all there is to it. Despite the opinion of a lot of TF2 players, there is genuine thought, positioning, and game knowledge that go into playing with this weapon well. Knowing when the best time to rev up is, gauging when it's more valuable to chase or let enemies come to you, carefully segmenting your attacks to make enemies unaware of whether or not you're approaching from around a corner, figuring out when's safe to unrev and regroup, when to eat your sandwich, things like that. The committal nature of the minigun combined with its massive damage effectively give it two modes that the player can dynamically shift between and leads to a really fun and satisfying gameplay loop for me. And whereas the Tomislav has flexibility, the Natascha has slowdown, the Huo-Long has fire, and the Brass Beast has raw damage, the minigun has fundamentals. This is the base that every other one of these weapons is built upon, the foundation of their success. While the Tomislav might offer more utility, the sheer reliability and fundamental usefulness of the minigun cannot go understated. There are situations where the Tomislav doesn't flourish, and sustained focus fire battles are against enemy heavies, but it's very rarely a straight up bad idea to bring the minigun. The minigun is just so goddamn cool to me. In my opinion, it's a quintessential example of what makes TF2 such an engrossing and brilliantly designed game. The idea that a playstyle as conceptually simple as slow damage-dealing tank could have so many hidden nuances that go into its design and application has yet to be replicated in any other game for me. To me, Heavy and his minigun are Team Fortress 2. They embody the largeness and in-chargeness of this game, its presentation, its boldness, its mechanical nuance, and its sheer personality. Some people love Soldier and his sky-high rocket jumps, Medic and his game-winning Ubers, or Spy and his play-facilitating infiltration, but above all else in TF2, I love Heavy and his minigun. They represent TF2 in its purest, most concentrated form. A conceptually simple, yet truly bold and unyielding powerhouse of a weapon for a bold and unyielding powerhouse of a game. That was a workout. I sincerely hope y'all enjoyed. I envisioned this video as a large, grandiose 30k sub celebration, so I hope it lived up to y'all's expectations. I know some of my takes from this video aren't exactly the most popular, so I'd love to hear feedback in the comments. Regardless, thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching. Here's to another 30k and more. Cheers!